This looks like a Mazda 3, but it's actually a $1 million prototype of the company's new Skyactiv chassis architecture and its new Skyactiv-X engine. Mazda engineer Jay Chen explains how spark-controlled compression ignition works and why it's such a breakthrough. Skyactiv-X from another angle. IRVINE, Calif. Despite rumors to the contrary, the internal combustion engine is far from dead. Recently we've seen several technological advances that will significantly boost the efficiency of gasoline-powered engines. One of these, first reported back in August 2017, is Mazda's breakthrough with compression ignition. On Tuesday, Mazda invited us to its road facility in California to learn more about this clever new Skyactiv-X engine, but more importantly we actually got to drive it on the road. What's so special about this engine then? The idea behind Skyactiv-X is to be able to run the engine with as lean a fuel-air mixture known as lambda as possible. Because very lean combustion is cooler than a stoichiometric reaction where lambda equals 1 and there is exactly enough air to completely burn each molecule of fuel, but no more, less energy is wasted as heat. What's more, the exhaust gases contain fewer nasty nitrogen oxides, and the unused air gets put to work. It absorbs the combustion heat and then expands and pushes down on the piston. The result is a cleaner, more efficient, and more powerful engine. And Skyactiv-X uses a very lean mix, a lambda up to 2.5. That sounds like an automotive holy grail, so you might be wondering why everyone isn't doing it. As is so often the case, the real-world isn't quite so simple. The problem with very lean air-fuel mixtures is that the combustion isn't particularly stable because the fuel molecules are so much less concentrated, it's easy for the combustion event to fizzle out. The solution, then, is to compress things to a much greater extent than normal. And if you compress the fuel and air enough, a wonderful thing happens: it ignites without the need for a spark. This is known as homogeneous charge compression ignition, or HCCI, an idea that Kyle Niemeyer covered in depth for us back in 2012. HCCI has some other advantages, too. On top of burning cooler and with fewer pollutants, the combustion event happens faster, with a higher pressure peak, so you get more work out of the same energy. All of that sounds pretty wonderful, so you're probably asking yourself why every gasoline engine on the road doesn't just use HCCI. Unfortunately, it has been one of those ideas that worked in the lab but couldn't ever quite be translated into a production engine. The biggest problem has always been controlling exactly when during the engine cycle compression ignition occurred, something that you want as close to top dead center as possible. HCCI, but with a spark plug. Mazda's breakthrough was in realizing that the spark plug could still have a role. The Skyactiv-X engine has been designed to have a very high compression ratio, 16:1 in fact, and to use the very lean air-fuel ratio, but both of these are just below the threshold needed for HCCI to occur. Instead, Mazda's engine uses a spark to get the party started. The resulting fireball then adds more heat and pressure to the combustion chamber, et voila! Compression ignition has been triggered. Mazda calls this spark-controlled compression ignition, or SPCCI. Obviously, this wasn't without challenges. The fuel-air mix needs to be a little richer near the spark for it to ignite than you want it to be throughout the rest of the cylinder. These need to be distinct regions, to avoid lambda dropping to 2 or below, which won't undergo compression ignition. That's achieved by swirling the air inside the cylinder and generating a vortex effect, where the calm center has a low enough lambda to ignite by spark, surrounded by a high lambda region that then undergoes compression ignition. Mazda's next challenge was to prevent pre-ignition, or knock. Higher compression ratios increase the potential for knock, which is why higher compression ratio engines usually also require more expensive, higher-octane fuel that is knock-resistant. Now, technically, compression ignition is knock, but if it occurs before you want it to, at top dead center, bad things can happen, because a combustion event will exert downward pressure on the piston as it's moving up on a compression stroke. The solution here was to use less time to heat the fuel-air mix. There's a small initial injection of fuel at first, then the bulk of the fuel is introduced into the cylinder as late as possible during the compression stroke. This is done using multiple orifice injectors to increase atomization and mixing of fuel and air. If all that wasn't enough, there's the added problem of keeping track of compression ignition. In the past, this has been one of the hardest problems for HCCI engines to solve. Ideally you want combustion to happen at the same point in the engine cycle each time, about 4 degrees after top dead center. But as ambient conditions change, a cold day in Denver versus a hot one in Houston, the time needed for the fireball to reach sufficient pressure also changes. So the engine ought to be able to change spark timing to keep the peak pressure at the right spot. Skyactiv-X does this by actively monitoring the pressure in each cylinder, so it knows the pressure rise trace of every combustion event. If it deviates, the spark timing is adjusted to compensate. Jay Chen, one of Mazda's powertrain engineers, explained that this was something the company had been thinking of for a while, but it has only recently been made possible now that engine control processes are fast enough to control things event by event. Skyactiv-X has some other features that differentiate it from Mazda's current Skyactiv-G engine family. It has a higher pressure direct injection fuel system to promote atomization that runs somewhere between a current gasoline direct injection system and a diesel dye system, although IWASNT able to get a specific fuel pressure figure. There are in-cylinder pressure sensors, which are necessary to feed the engine's digital brains the data it needs to control timing. There's a low boost roots type supercharger of sorts. Mazda calls this a high response air supply, as its job ISNT to add power, and it only really contributes under high loads. There's also an air-to-water intercooler, an exhaust gas recirculator EGR cooler that helps prevent premature combustion, electric variable valve timing actuators that use stepper motors for faster valve timing, and, finally, a 48V mild hybrid start-stop system. Listing image by Jonathan Gitlin. Page 2. The end result is a 2.0L, 4-cylinder engine, made from aluminum, that runs on 87-octane fuel but has a 30% increase in peak torque compared to the company's current Skyactiv-G unit. Because SPCCI releases so much energy in such a short amount of time, it pushes the pistons down with more force at low RPM, which means more torque and therefore more drivability. You can run the engine on higher octane fuels, and it will adapt to shift the torque peak higher up the rev range. Although Mazda isn't prepared to quote specific fuel economy numbers, it told US that Skyactiv-X should be at least 20% better than Skyactiv-G, which is currently class-leading. But the biggest difference is that this low fuel use occurs over a wide range of engine loads, not just at a specific sweet spot. So the real-world MPG ought to more closely match the published ratings. And because of this, there's less penalty for higher RPM, which means a more responsive and more powerful engine. The vehicle can even be geared up for faster acceleration. You said they let you drive it after a couple of hours of very dense but very informative technical briefings. It was finally time to hit the streets in several matte grey road mules. For the outside these looked just like regular Mazda 3s, but those looks were most deceiving. Under the hood of each was a Skyactiv-X engine, encased in covers because their NVH characteristics are closer to a diesel than a normal gasoline engine. The road vehicles were also using Mazda's new Skyactiv vehicle architecture and the company's latest C technology. For the next 2 hours we drove around Orange County in both automatic and manual cars, and, if anything, it was the most anticlimactic part of the day. If you didn't know that you were driving a prototype, which had a tablet mounted on the dash indicating when the engine was operating under SPCCI and when it was just using regular old spark ignition, you'd have no idea anything special took place. There were no coughs or hiccups, and I couldn't find any weak spots in the rev range. I would love to know our fuel consumption, but sadly the WASNT readout available to us in the cars. I do love me a prototype, whether that's a race car or an road test bed. This is obviously the latter. On the road in the prototype, the large dots on the tablet indicate which mode the engine is running in this case it's in SPCCI. To improve NHV, the engine is encapsulated under this cover. A Mazda engineer sneaks a peek under the engine cover. A handy conversion chart for American and, in my case, British journalists who don't think in kilometer per hour. Nope, that's not a production car. Another prototype returns from a test drive. Why are they bothering at this point? I'm sure some of you are wondering why Mazda has even bothered with all this work given that the future is electric. Don't think I haven't noticed that Playgov should have just bought a Tesla. Comments of late. However, while most US readers will agree that a fully battery electric fleet is desirable, it's important to realize that a lot of work remains before that becomes a realistic proposition. Last year was the best ever year for electric vehicle sales, yet gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles still made up 98.8% of the 17.2 million new vehicles sold in 2017. Realistically, we're decades away from battery EVs becoming the dominant or only kind of powertrain on the roads. In the meantime then, technological advances that boost the efficiency of gasoline-powered vehicles are a most laudable effort. And there's a fair bit of that happening right now. At the same time that Mazda was hosting journalists in IRVINE to try out Skyactiv-X, Infiniti was holding the first drive for its QX50, which is powered by another clever new engine that features a variable compression ratio. Since human cloning remains illegal, I had to pick between one and the other, and having recently interviewed Nissan's chief powertrain engineer about that VC turbo, I opted to bring you this Mazda deep dive. Well, drive the QX50 when it hits the press fleets. You've also got other engine advances like dynamic skip fire, a very clever cylinder deactivation technology from Tula and Delphi that I'll be telling you all about in the near future. Each of these should boost gasoline efficiency by at least 20%, and on top of that, there is plenty of other low-hanging fruit for powertrain and vehicle engineers to gather: lightweighting, regenerative braking, mild hybridization, and so on. All of these can also be combined with stronger hybridization for ever more efficient vehicles. Mazda says it's working on EV technology and also next-generation diesel engine, but the company is very proud of the fact that it has the best average fleet economy of any OEM selling cars in the US, 30.1 mpg and 295 grams CO2 mile, despite not having any hybrids or EVs. The fact that it is a relative minnow compared to the massive whales that are companies like General Motors, Toyota, or Volkswagen Group is surely an impressive feat. Skyactiv-X should be on sale next year, but, for the time being, we think it'll be exclusive to Mazda vehicles. Although Mazda and Toyota entered into a technology partnership, Masashi Otsuka, VP Road and Design at Mazda, told me that where and when it makes sense for both companies to work together, we will. But it has to be beneficial to both companies. If I was a Toyota executive, I'd be thinking of how large a licensing check I could write that would make that equation work.